Starting time now. We affirm contention 1 is developing futures. IMF programs help developing countries in 4 key ways. First is Imf Currency. Sanchez 21 states that the IMF provides SDRs during times of crisis, which are reserve assets that can be traded with between countries in exchange for liquidity or cash. BWP 09 furthers that SDRs have no conditions attached, and Reuters 21 gives the context, where every member of the IMF has received $500 billion in SDRs and have historically increased reserves by about 19% for low-income countries, restoring market confidence and supporting global recovery after the '08 crisis. Critically, Sonnet 20 states that SDRs are one of the most useful instruments to help contain the pandemic and keep the global economy from further collapsing. Global COVID response furthers that SDRs could be used by countries around the world for much needed medical supplies and necessities and other economic calamities that will push hundreds of millions into poverty and hunger. Specifically, Oxfam states that COVID could push 500 million people into poverty. Second is social investment. In the largest and most recent study conducted on this topic, Michelle Shenda 20 of Harvard University analyzed IMF government expenditure conditions across 115 countries over 24 years and found that IMF conditional programs boost long-term levels of education, health, and investment expenditures. Shenda continues that IMF programs spur this increase in 3 key ways. First, improvements in accounting and financial reporting ensure that countries effectively allocate and track resources, allowing budgeted increases in social spending to actually come to fruition. Second, improved budget execution reduces the risk of diversion of social funds or the possibility of budget deficits from emerging, ensuring that social sectors receive their budgeted allocations. Third, reduction in debts and a control over surplus spending leads to increased availability of resources for productive spending, including on education and health. Ultimately, Shena concludes that IMF programs boost public investment in developing countries by 19% in the long term. Third is economic structuring. IMF programs focus on liberalized protectionist economies. Bull 06 finds that 3/4 of IMF programs include conditionalities on commitments to trade liberalization. This liberalization drives export diversification, as Owasaki in 2018 explains that trade liberalization in the form of lower tariffs contributes to export diversification in developing countries in short and long term through increased market access and sector viability. This is important as Owasaki continues that increased diversification leads to lower output volatility and greater macroeconomic stability, playing a central role in developing countries' sustainable prospects. Gondon in 2018 confirms that a 1 point increase in the index of multilateral trade liberalization promotes the economic growth rate of developing countries by 28%. And for this reason, Bird 16 concludes that IMF programs increase economic growth rates through the years, following signing by over 2%, with the magnitude increasing over time. Fourth is boosting stature. Gore states that prior to the early 2000s, the majority of low development countries were stuck in development traps, characterized by economic stagnation and chronic poverty. This is because low-income countries cannot save or invest, hence remaining trapped at a constant low or middle income level, as E115 states. Thus, it is hard to attract investment because of the small market size from lack of consumption and high risk. The IMF solves this, as Beglasier writes that IMF lending increases capital inflows by 61% through signaling a country's economic future. Lee 19 explains that this inflow of capital drives productivity and actualization of local wages. Gore concludes increases in income and consumption are necessary to escape this trap. The holistic impacts of IMF programs are significant, as Graham Bird 20 of the Department of Economic Sciences provides the most up-to-date and methodologically refined study on the matter. Bird, in the 2 years following IMF program signing, finds that income inequality decreases by 8% and total poverty decreases by 14%. And through a year following program completion, infant mortality decreases by another 14%. All in all, dollar terminalizes by opening up their economies to the global economy. The number of people in poverty declined by over 120 million. For these reasons, Ryan and I are proud to affirm.
University negates. Davis 04 writes that while OECD nations historically lifted people out of poverty through trade, they did it in tandem with tariffs and subsidies to develop domestic industries. However, he writes, the IMF kicks away the ladder of support of developing countries, and the Huffington Post in 2019 concurs that underdeveloped nations whose domestic industries can't compete with global firms get killed off by imports, trapping them in cycles in underdevelopment. David thus concludes that the main single cause of increase in poverty since the 1980s has been the retreat from these state policies. For example, Piano in 2014 writes that under state-led development, Latin America's annual GDP growth set record highs, with GDP increasing by 5.5% every single year. However, under IMF neoliberal policies, Latin America's per capita GDP went from being 20% above the world average to 11% below it. Thus, contention 1 is the planet of slums. Subpoint A is housing. Rickards in 2019 writes that 100% of IMF loans since the 1990s forced governments to cut spending on programs with the least political influential interests, slashing spending into pro-poor services such as housing subsidies. Mahmoud in 2010 2010 explains that since the state can no longer help housing subsidies, housing supplies in the developing world rarely met 20% of housing needs. Thus, Mahmoud concludes that IMF policies have been proven to create the inevitable recipe for the massive production of slums. Subpoint B is ravaging rural areas. Reinsberg in 2019 explains that the IMF has imposed changes to food and agriculture sectors in 100 countries. For one, Chandra in 2010 finds the IMF eliminated subsidies in Africa for food, pesticide, and fertilizers with higher costs. Poor rural farmers are unable to compete and forced to leave their farms. Moreover, Sonkin in 2020 reports that the IMF has played a pivotal role in enabling the financialization trend of rural economies through the financial sector deregulation and consolidating wealth among financial actors such as private equity funds who have little interest in feeding the world to seize public lands. Thus, Marlino in 2018 quantifies that the IMF enabled land grabs that pushed tens of millions of farmers off their lands and have left 2 billion people malnourished and 124 million people in crisis-level hunger. The destruction of traditional rural economies accelerated the process of rural-urban migration in these countries. Thus, Prakash concludes that 50 million people leave rural areas every year to go to slums. Subpoint C is the shadow economy. Lang in 2010 finds that pension cuts or freezes are frequently included in IMF programs along with minimum wage reductions. Without adequate salaries, urban citizens are pushed into informal or shadow economies, which characterized by below substance wages and slums. Kellis in 2020 quantifies that an increase in IMF participation by 1 standard deviation results in an increase in the shadow economy by 2.6%. Mahmoud thus concludes that liberalization has created a dumping ground for mega slums by accelerating job inequality, as informal workers now comprise over half of the workforce in Latin America, with over 70% in sub-Saharan Africa as well. For these three reasons, Davis 06 writes that when the IMF restructured the economies of the third world in the 1980s, slums became an undeniable future for millions of poor rural migrants and traditional urban citizens. Olini in 2016 quantifies that 1 in 6 human beings on the planet today will live in slums, which is projected to rise to 1 in 4 or 2 billion people by 2030. Problematically, Marx in 2013 explains that slums result in coordination problems that hinder investment in unsanitary living conditions that affect human capital, creating a poverty trap for its residents, creating 2.6 times higher mortality rates for under 5 kids and then non-slum areas. Moreover, Johnson in 2017 explains that because of non-existent sanitation, dirty water, in close proximity to animals, scientists feel that the next pandemic will start from a slum, which Samuel in 2019 quantifies will kill 80 million people, which can reverse all the economic gains made in the last 2 decades. Contention 2 is austerity. The IMF has doubled down on COVID. Oxfam explains that 80% of COVID loans push for austerity measures that result in deep cuts in public healthcare. Oxfam furthers that countries are encouraged to freeze or cut public sector wages and jobs, meaning lower quality healthcare, fewer nurses and doctors. In fact, the WHO in 2020 finds that by 2030, countries who are receiving IMF assistance will see a shortage of 695,000 doctors. As a result, disease is running rampant, as Sambo 04 concludes that in Africa, structural adjustment policies led to the tripling of malaria deaths and resurgence of infectious diseases. Thus, PT in 09 quantifies that 5 million children around the world die every single year due to IMF programs. Thus, we negate the resolution. Thank you.
Okay. So in your evidence, what does a 1 standard deviation in IMF participation mean? Like, what does that look like?
So when countries no longer gradually decrease their participation from IMF loans and lending.
But I'm asking, what's a 1 standard deviation increase? Like, what percentage?
So compared to if they access all of their loans, for example, and receive all of their loans, stop taking loans, and decrease gradual participation with the IMF, that is a standard deviation decrease.
I'm asking what percentage is the 1 standard deviation? What does it correlate?
I just explained it to you. When these countries participate less within the IMF by taking on less loans. I don't know what else you want me to say.
So a standard deviation translates to a percentage increase. What is that percentage increase?
I mean, I can't tell you, but all I can tell you is that IMF participation goes down, which is our argument.
Warren, so I'm talking about specific card, but you can have a question.
Sure. So let's talk about special drawing rights compared to the rest of your arguments. So special drawing rights are IMF loans that do not require conditions or any sort of reforms. But then you also say that the IMF does impose reforms through trade liberalization. So does the IMF impose both, or is it just one or the other?
I mean, they have SDRs and they have loans. They're 2 separate things. They do them like separately. And
okay. So they can always happen simultaneously, right? So a country can have austerity measures and have to cut public health spending at the same time as receiving SDRs?
Yeah, it's true.
Then what's the
good question? So
yeah, go for it.
What's inherently bad about the shadow economy?
Yeah, so those living in the shadow economy often have low wages, low substance to survive within the economy in the first place, and often live in slums. Can I take a question?
Is there a trade-off between the shadow economy and the formal economy? So if the shadow economy increases, does the formal economy decrease?
We say that urban citizens within urban areas are pushed towards the shadow economy. That's all our argument is.
Okay,
I'm going to take the question.
You didn't respond, but okay.
Yeah. So let's talk about trade liberal. Actually, yeah, let's talk about this dollar evidence at the bottom of your case. You say that the terminal impact is 120 million.
Yeah.
Where is the dollar evidence from?
I don't know. We sent it to you. Where is it from?
The dollar evidence is from the IMF itself. So if the IMF is coming out and saying that, oh, 120 million people are being lifted out of poverty, isn't that like a biased source and they're only cherry picking ideas? Or like, how is this study done?
I mean, you can look to the methodologies of the study, but just because it comes
Yeah,
from
obviously the IMF is only going to report the good things about the study that they've led to, right? For example, if I'm the NRA and I have a gun, like the gun studies, I'm only going to say that guns are good.
No,
So like,
IMF has historically reported bad things and failures with projects. Like that's
what?
I mean, I can find examples if you want me to.
If all the IMF blogs that you cite are just good rhetoric about the IMF, but that aren't actual empirical analysis done by other organizational institutions. So I don't know how we buy the credibility of 120 million.
If you want, we'll contest it.
Perfect. This is gonna be a paper rebuttal. I can send any cards that I reference right after the speech. Let's start with their observation. They tell you that the IMF caused poverty empirically, but their analysis is conveniently from 2004. We'd argue a much better comprehensive way to look at the long-term economic effects of neoliberal reforms is to take studies that analyze all countries that have dealt with these reforms and look at them over the long term. That's what the BERT evidence in our case says. You're going to prefer this evidence for two reasons. First, it analyzes all low-income countries that have gone through IMF programs. And secondly, it looks at this residual effects on economic growth using endogeneity causal principles. This is an important methodological difference because their study cannot isolates the effects of IMF programs versus the preceding effects that causes the IMF to go into places. Obviously, if places in economic destruction, the IMF will go there. They can't prove to you that the IMF ruined it. We'd say our empirics are better. But let's move on to my opponent's arguments. First, on slums, they tell you that housing subsidies go away. We'd argue that subsidies go away worse in a country without the IMF because, firstly, debt servicing is a debt servicing. A 1% increase in the amount of debt you have decreases the amount you can put to social spending. But when the IMF comes in and gives countries liquidity, they're able to pay off their debts and then remove this constant drain of their assets. That's why our evidence from Shana indicates that in the long term, you actually see 19% boosts in public spending and public investment for things like subsidies. But secondly, we'd argue that the alternative is that they're going to be defaulting on their debts when they're in these tough economic situations. But thankfully, the IMF reduces their sovereign credit, their sovereign debt risk by increasing capital investment because they stand as a positive signal for a long-term macroeconomic future. Default would be much worse because it would push people all into poverty and the government would not be able to support them at all. But let's move on to their second argument. We're going to agree with them. Sure, in the agricultural industry, getting rid of protections devastates it, but this is good for two reasons. First, food imports are historically cheaper, which means you see greater access to food in these countries. That's more important because without food, you see greater rates of mortality. But secondly, according to Conway in 2019, the prerequisite to becoming a long-term developed economy and joining global trade markets is going away from your agrarian roots. That's very important because by destroying domestic industry, which would otherwise have left their development capped and unable to lift the people currently in poverty out of poverty, you see them liberalize, increase production in productive sectors, and go away from this. That's why empirically you see the nutritional gap decrease by 7% after liberalization. And income inequality decrease. But now, onto the shadow economy. First of all, we'd argue that the preceding trends of economic devastation is obviously going to be pushing people in the shadow economy. They can't prove the increase. Their increase is a one standard deviation. I have no idea what it means. They couldn't effectively explain it to Dean and Crossfire. What percent increase is that? What does it even mean for a standard deviation in an IMF program? But secondly, we'd say that you're actually protecting state interests with IMF programs, which it decreases things like terrorism that often are causes of the illicit economy because you were able to redistribute money to the people that would be turning against the state. That's very important because empirically, Hartzell indicates, for example, they actually decrease the amount of civil unrest or civil wars that could lead to greater impacts of a greater informal economy. But ultimately, we're going to argue that the biggest impact here is income inequality, which we are winning because our BERT evidence indicates it decreases by 14%. It doesn't matter if wages decrease if your relative purchasing power and relative position in the society increases because you actually reap greater benefits. Absolute mean value is a non-comprehensive way to understand this. We'd say that since our evidence is greater than theirs, comes a lot after theirs, you're preferring it. Finally, on the impact level, they say mortality rates increase, but once again, it's going to be the same study they're referencing about the same study they're referencing from that is not able to remove the effects of neoliberal reform to the between the IMF. Then they say the next pandemic is going to be caused by slums. It'll kill 80 million people. There is no explanation here. This is just the reading of a one sentence of definitely a blog. For example, the COVID pandemic we're doing right now has not I'm sorry. Like off a blog, there's no reason to think or why a virus would come out of slums. Give them some indication of how that's going to happen. But now, on the amount of austerity, we're winning in the long term because our analysis about a 19% increase accounts for their warrants. Even if you see social spending before the IMF gets there, it's not effectively being allocated, which means that the amount of money supposedly going to social sectors isn't actually coming to fruition. The prerequisite to long-term social spending is effective allocation, but the second prerequisite is getting rid of the high debt service ratings that prevent states and prevent them from actually dedicating this money. That's why our evidence indicates more holistically that you see a 14% decrease in income inequality. Ultimately, if the theoretical considerations are too contradictory, Bird explains that since the indirect and direct effects have been so contested in literature, I'm at like 3:59 according to my timer, are so contested in literature that the only proper way to induce the effects of IMF programs is to look empirically. We do that with all our evidence.
Okay, it's going to follow the same structure of his rebuttal, and then it's just going to move. It's going to be responding to his rebuttal, weighing their case. Okay. If everybody's ready, then let's begin. On the overview, we explained that countries are have better economic growth absent IMF. They just use this Bird study to say, oh, everything's good after the IMF. First of all, they don't answer any of the warrants that gradual liberalization would have happened in either world. It's just that the IMF forced them to open up all barriers, which collapse their economy. However, if you give them time, they're able to build up domestic industries, which led to a lot higher growth. They just say their Bird evidence solves. Couple issues. One, no warranting why our evidence isn't true. Two, their Bird evidence isn't as good as they say it is. Scroll down a couple pages. It says all of those effects become muted after a couple of years and start to backslide because of the long-term effects of austerity, meaning that in the long run, we are winning that more people are negatively affected by the IMF. Specifically on our argument about slums, this is what we're going to go for. Their first two responses essentially say that the IMF saves countries from debt, but you can turn this because Lerman in 2016 finds is that IMF programs, countries have to wait for 4 years to follow all austerity measures, and if they don't, the IMF doesn't give them the loan. That's why he finds empirically in places like Africa during the African debt crisis, after IMF involvement, overall debt levels increased by 16%, meaning it turns all of their turns on domestic spending, and this also answers all of their turns on our argument about austerity. But we are going to go for our argument about rural areas. Their first response says that you can increase food imports. Problematically, that means one, you're paying for the food, which means you're taking out money from things such as access to healthcare, but two, you're also destroying people's livelihoods. They have conceded that the IMF privatizes industries that allows for land grabs, pushing millions of people off their land. Their second argument is you can have long-term development of moving to urban areas, but this is also not true because you're forcing them outside of their industries right now, and domestic countries don't have the industries to support such a mass migration of people. On the impact level, they just say, one, we don't warrant why the pandemics can start in slums. Yes, we clearly do. In case we say that slums have less access to healthcare, less access to education, which means they're more likely to spread diseases because you're more in close proximity. Moreover, they've also conceded the uniqueness that more people are going to slums. What this means is that on their infrastructure argument, the amount of infrastructure is not solving for the overall amount of people being forced into slums. But let's go to their case. First of all, on their first argument about SDRs, first, the EA in 2020 finds it's not used enough because 1 billion out of 183 billion SDRs in 2008 was used because the system is so archaic and it's hard to transfer between the IMF. But second, if one country messes up while using SDRs, then the pandemic continues to spread and these countries are still forced to shut down, meaning you can't get out of it. On their second argument about social spending, first of all, group all three of their links, couple responses. First, their group the evidence is terrible. It does not say where the public spending goes, no methodology, and it's from the IMF, and does not say the word infrastructure whatsoever. Second, you can turn it because Ghazali in 2018 finds the infrastructure and public spending is just when the IMF allows US businesses to build massive, costly infrastructure, and the country cannot pay it off, creating a crisis every few years. But third, even if you build public infrastructure, if subsidies are cut, nobody can get access to it. That's why slums are increasing in the scope, even with the IMF. On their argument about trade liberalization, one, the Pineo evidence does the comparative that the IMF forced liberalization, which caused lower growth rates than if the countries did it on their own. Second, they say it leads to an increase in diversification. This is also not true. Tocqueville in 2001 finds the IMF devalues a country's currencies to increase exports and natural resources, locking them in a cycle where trade is only based on one industry. On their argument about increasing investment, the IMF borrowers tend to be more attractive to US investors. Problematically, this leads to new neocolonialism, as Tocqueville in 01 writes that in order to attract foreign investment, investment. The IMF recipient countries prioritize appeasing investors over environmental objectives by increasing natural resource extraction, turning their trade argument. But second, Reynolds in 2013 finds that foreign companies crowd out domestic companies by dropping prices drastically, undercutting foreign companies. And Baker finds that a 10% increase in FDI decreases domestic firms by 7%, which is the base of all of the country's economies.
For sure. So let's go ahead and talk about these domestic firms being undercut.
Yeah.
So which specific like domestic sectors are we talking about here?
Whatever domestic and like tech,
What
manufacturing.
Sectors in developing world, people generally have less money, makes it more profitable for transnational companies to flood in goods.
Wait, what'd you say?
So what sectors in developing countries make sense for transnational investors to flood in goods at prices that are lower because they know that people have to charge lower prices so people can afford them? What sectors are good for that?
Like any demand-based sector.
What?
Manufacturing.
Manufacturing of what? That's not a sector. Manufacturing.
I don't know where you're going with this question.
Figure out what's being undercut. You say that this is the foundation of these countries' domestic economies. What is it?
Any industry. I mean, like
No, you gotta give me.
Yeah, like you name one, and then we can talk about it, and then we can talk about like the incentives.
No, that you can't talk about incentives. You just told me that the foundation for these countries, their economic foundations in the form of sectors are being undercut by transnational companies.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Developing infrastructure, like water infrastructure is like a very good one.
So construction companies are the ones that
are sure. Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. Good question.
Okay, so let's talk about this bird study. So you say that what is endogeneity?
Endogeneity is an error that happens when you are unable to isolate a preceding condition from a causal relationship that analyzes time past that condition. And how that plays out here is...
Okay, wait. So slow down. Like, can you just explain it in like just like common sense terms? Because whatever you were just saying did not make sense.
That's why I'm following it with here's in a practical.
Okay.
Sample selection bias in past IMF studies is difficult because because the IMF goes to places that are in economic trouble, right?
Right.
It's likely that economic trouble is preceding IMF intervention. So how do you isolate IMF effects versus long-term trends that were those preceding economic conditions?
Oh, okay. Well, so then our Pineo evidence is pretty good at that.
Does it?
Yeah, because it does, like, your bird evidence is not answering our Pineo evidence, because our Pineo analysis is that these countries had higher growth rates pre-IMF, and they were going to continue to have higher growth rates because they were following the same structure of high developed countries like the US, where you gradually take off tariffs.
Wait, no, that's not true. Why was the IMF there if they had high growth rates?
Wait.
The IMF goes to countries that are in economic woes. It's analyzing growth rates preceding economic destruction that led to IMF intervention. The IMF was not intervening in places with fantastic growth rates. That's not true at all.
But wait, that's just like, okay, all right, wait. To be very clear, there could still be economic crises caused by like absent, like things that's not controlled, but our analysis is still correct that you can have higher growth absent the IMF, right?
No, we'd say they wouldn't because they're in economic crises.
But we're saying post-crises.
All right, we have 1 minute of prep left.
Yeah, sure. All right, can you wait for COVID? All the yeah. All right, I'll be starting on economic structuring, stature, and then I'll go to social investment, and then their case. Starting time now. First on economic structuring, they read one term saying that like IMF forces liberalization. One, they never proved that liberalization happens outside of the IMF. Their only card says that Latin America did well under state-led development. That's not liberalization. That's state-led development. That could be anything else. The card is completely uncontextualized. They have to prove that any liberalization happening. But then second, on structuring, they say that like you see a crowd of domestic companies. We say that's good because on that you see more jobs being created by those private firms. But secondly, this crowd is only in the manufacturing sector. These service sectors are still domestic, which means people still have jobs. It's a complete mitigation. But then where we're going to vote for us is on social investment. They read one response saying that the Gupta card is bad and it comes from the IMF. Gupta isn't even from the IMF. The bird evidence is really good. Brian explains it in Crossfire. Analyzes 115 countries over 24 years and shows a 90% increase in public spending. But then their second response is saying that it doesn't even mention infrastructure. That's not our argument. We don't mention infrastructure either. We say that you see better budget execution and a decrease in debt reduction per the IMF because that's how the IMF helps these countries. That's really good because that leads to our impacts. We see a 14% decrease decrease in poverty, a 14% decrease in infant mortality, and an 8% decrease in inequality. Overall, 120 million people are taken out of poverty. With that, let's look to their case. On their case, at the top level, their narrative is faulty. The IMF did not enter countries that were prosperous. They went to places with devastated economies because the current trends were not working. That makes sense because that's the reason as to why the countries weren't doing well afterwards, because the countries initially weren't doing well. It's a causal relationship. It just makes sense. But now let me tell you why you're not voting for their argument. One, they dropped the response saying that the nutritional gap actually decreased after you saw liberalization in these economies, even if it was promoted by the IMF. But then secondly, we say that food imports are cheaper. Their only response is saying that people paid for foods. In the past, people still paid for foods. It just was worked on a local market. It's not just I like grow crops for just my family. It's still like there's still a local market. And if anything, this is actually really good because it increases long-term food security. But then secondly, we read a prerequisite saying that shifting from agrarian economies to more productive sectors is good in the long term. They respond by saying you're forcing them out of the industry. Yes, that's our argument. But the agriculture is only a small subsection of the industry. On net, this is still a lot better because you see an increase in long-term food security and an increase in economic growth. Ryan's weighing to food security as to a prerequisite is a prerequisite to long-term growth, because if you have food security, then you're able to grow in the long term because people have access to good nutrition and whatnot. But then on slums, their argument is that you've seen an increase in the amount of pandemics, but the problem with this is that slums are entirely non-unique. Urbanization happens regardless of the IMF increasing the IMF kicking farmers out of the IMF. Urbanization happens regardless, and slums would always be created. If anything, they need to prove that it's unique to the IMF and that slums wouldn't have been created either way. But then secondly, they can't apply farmers to their whole link because they didn't extend the impact about getting farmers out of their land. But overall, it's an easy yeah, which means that slums are non-unique in the long term. I mean, their impact is non-unique. Their link doesn't make sense, and social spending solves back, because if you have social spending, you're able to give people food, help the economy in the long term, which solves back for slums. I mean, if you help the economy in the long term, give people food, it decreases the chance of infection and whatnot.
Everyone's ready. I will begin. The IMF is no longer an economic institution for development, but rather a political weapon designed to exploit developing countries. Let's deal in a world where without the IMF, specifically the Pinot evidence indicates that prior to joining the IMF, Latin American countries experienced double-digit economic growth and 20% GDP above the national average. However, as soon as they joined the IMF, and they have conceded this warranting analysis that these domestic firms within these local countries were crowded out by international businesses, and as a result, their countries suffered dramatically. The only response here that we get is A, countries wouldn't join the IMF if they weren't in a crisis. That doesn't mean they can seek economic advice in the first place. And B, moreover, if these countries are joining just to make sure they're on the right footing, even one investment can hamper long-term development from the IMF. This is really crucial because our evidence concludes that the root cause of all poverty reductions and poverty increases is because of IMF creations. All their bird evidence and all of their bird analyses also concede that all of the benefits that they themselves talk about go away after 2 years of any sort of programs, meaning that there's no way to vote for the affirmative. But let's go to our arguments about slums. They have conceded our first subpoint about housing. Our Rickards evidence indicates that 100% of IMF loans since the 1990s have forced cuts in spending, and as a result, only 20% of countries are allocated to able to provide any sort of housing for the people. As a result, our Prakash evidence indicates that 50 million people leave every single year to go to slums. Why is this important? Because the only thing that he says is that A, urbanization is inevitable, but the rate at which urbanization happens is predicated on our argument about slums. If 50 million people are leaving every single year, that means those city planners cannot or will not be able to handle the rapid influx of slums. But second, he says that our argument about pandemics is unwarranted. The warranting is pretty simple. When people are forced to live in slums and below subsistence wages, they're often crowded together and as a result have poor sanitation and have poor living quality. That is why our evidence about Samuel is conceded that indicates that the next pandemic will start in these slum areas, killing 80 million people. But moreover, they have conceded the time frame analysis that during the long term, by 2030, 2 billion people will be living in slums. Why does this compare to their argument about social spending? Because any argument about recession, sure, the IMF may stop 1 or 2 economic shocks, may increase inequality or decrease inequality for a little bit, but policy prescription have put developing countries in a perpetual cycle of recession. This acts as a prerequisite because through negative development, you can build up the state capacity and prevent and respond to their development issues. And moreover, this always on time frame because recessions can happen once every decade, while the IMF's underdevelopment policies have hurt living citizens every single day. Moreover, our arguments have affect 2 billion people, while at best they affect 120 million people. Let's go to their case. Their only argument is social infrastructure, but let's extend the response that during times that when the IMF attracts US investment and attracts US infrastructure, they're often too costly, and as a result, these countries are stuck in infinite debt cycles. They just say, no, our argument is not about infrastructure. Well, if these countries have to continue to rack up debt, as a result, they're not able to solve back for anything. And finally, on their weighing, they say they solve because food security is a prerequisite. There is no warrant as to why that's true.
Okay, yeah.
Can we agree that debt, so we agree that debt offsets social spending, right?
No.
Why not? You read 2 turns on our first argument about housing.
Yeah, we're going for the first warrant on social spending from Shana, which is
What?
even if spending decreases, effective allocation increases, so you still see greater investment.
So but you still have to pay back the debt, right? That's your argument.
It doesn't matter though, because previous to it, any money is not successfully allocated there, which means that on net you still see an increase in success.
Wait, but even if it's better allocated, you still have to pay more debt, right?
Yeah, but the thing is,
I don't
like,
understand logic.
It's like debt drastically increases, but you can more effectively pay for it. I still don't understand what that really means, but
but like the issue is, you can think about it this way, like a country has like $20. Previous to it, we can say that $10 was going to paying off debt, and then they said that another $10 was going to the social sector. However, at the time, really only $5 was going because the allocation was so effective. So even if debt service payments increased to say 12, and then there was only 8 left, all 8 of that successfully went to there, which is why the
I'm pretty sure what's conceded that debt levels are drastically increasing, and it traps our evidence concludes that it traps them in cycles of debt defaults, which offset any of your benefits of social spending, right?
Though, because we still win you don't respond to the impact. All your ideas about debt are not quantitative, they're warrant based, but we show you empirically this isn't good. This isn't Bird or Gupta. This isn't Bird. This is Shana. Who indicates that in the long term, you see public investment in education and health increase by 19%.
Yeah, and our analysis is going to be that's all just offset in the long run because of debt crises. But you can have a question.
Wait, you can't say that that's gonna be offset from debt crises. That weighing wasn't in the summary.
Yeah,
Anon literally says it takes out all benefits of the AF.
The debt service payments take away the idea that money can be invested in the social sector.
I have a question. So let's look to the card, the Pinio card, right? In case you read it as quote, however, under IMF neoliberal policies, blah blah blah, right? But when you go to the actual card, where does it say?
Wait, what?
Where does it say IMF?
Really?
Neoliberalism. I'm pretty sure. I don't have the card pulled up. Let me get it.
I'll pause time and you can go look at the card, but it doesn't say the word IMF. It just says neoliberal policies.
Yes, and the the IMF was the biggest insert. There's a reason why they just randomly switched away from ISI policies to neoliberalism, and that was the IMF. For your argument to be true, you need the IMF in Latin America, right? I think there's a silly argument to explain.
All right. Can we take a question?
Yeah, well, we don't talk about this a little bit more. There's a ton of other organizations that are neoliberal as well. There's World Bank. There's a bunch of development banks. I mean,
that's true for all your arguments, and everything you talk about can be
right.
solved.
That's true for everything in this round. That's a really silly argument.
I don't understand how that applies.
Also, wasn't in a speech.
Yeah, we have 5 seconds left, so it's time.
Sounds good. It's gonna go their case, our case. Actually, our case, their case. I like that order better. Is anybody not ready? Is anybody not ready? Perfect. Time can start now. There's 2 places to vote for us. Let's read the first one. Its case. Our warrant is conceded. Shana indicates that effective allocation of spending due to IMF programs increases public investment in the long term by 19%. They try to apply a term that deemed frontline as defense. They weren't successful though because our term takes account for it. Even if debt is increasing and social expenditures are decreasing, the money being allocated to these sectors is actually getting there, which is why this investment is increasing by 19%. That's not responded to at any point in the round. It's been a very easy place to vote because look at the impact level. Dean extended that this decreases income inequality by 7%. It decreases poverty by 14%. And it decreases infant mortality by 14%. That's the first place to vote for us. Let's go to their case. there is a major disconnect in this round between their arguments and their impacts. It's going to become prevalent. Before I get to the top shelf, let's go to their argument about slums. They end up collapsing on housing. However, they didn't extend this in the summary speech. And in fact, in the summary speech, they extended their links on rural areas. But let's review the housing responses. Since social spending increases in the long term, you actually see the effective allocation of money to the public sector, which is why you would not see these effects reach the manifestation it does. But then they try to apply this argument to the impact that 2 billion people are moving into slums. Not at any point in the argument does it indicate that this housing subsidy is increasing slums. It doesn't. That's why they can't extend it in the summary speech. There's a huge disconnect between their arguments. They can't apply this one to their entire impact. But let's review the second place you can vote for us. It's on the rural areas argument. They completely concede the FOA evidence that indicates that by liberalizing trade, you decrease food prices, which decreases the nutritional gap by 6%. I read Wang and rebuttal that was conceded in the summary that food security is being more important because without food, you don't see productivity, you don't see an effective increase in long-term economic growth, and you see populations devastated, which is why you would not see any of their benefits materialize in the long run. That's a very clean place to vote for us as well because the prerequisite Wang is conceded. The final doubt you might have about pulling the trigger for our AF on our conceded case is the idea that trade liberalization hurt these countries, but they concede the analysis that the IMF was only in these countries because they're facing severe economic crises. It's unfair to look at when they were being growth and say, oh, that growth would have persisted, but in reality, that growth led to economic crises that warranted IMF intervention that in the long run actually pulled 120 million people out of poverty. For these reasons, wait, it's 2:04, man. Don't need to interrupt me.
Oh no, sorry. I wasn't sure if you're going to say we affirm. I thought it was done. My bad. Okay. It's going to start on our case and go to their case, weighing in between. Okay. They know they're losing on our case. That's why they start saying stuff like there's a huge disconnect. I can explain the argument. Our argument is 100% of IMF loans since the 90s have forced spending cuts with the least political interests, but such as things such as pro-poor services, such as housing. As a result, the Mahmoud evidence concludes that because the state can't provide supplies of housing in the global south only meets 20% of the needs. As a result, when you can't have housing, like pro-poor housing, you can't afford it, you are forced to live in places like slums. This is why our Davis evidence concludes that after the 80s, when the IMF inserted itself in the majority of developing countries, slums became an impeccable future. That's why it's going to reach 2 billion by 2030. And problematically for them, the scope weighings conceded that we are affecting the most amount of people in the round because if you don't have housing, you're forced to live in slums. Their only response isn't actually responding to housing, so you can just pull the trigger for that. On their turn, it just says that malnutrition decreased by 6%. This is not completely stop state capacity with a decrease in malnutrition by 6%. It's not contextualized at all how much this actually hurts economic growth. But you do know that when you're living in slums, you're trapped without an education, without healthcare, leading millions of people to die and hundreds of thousands of poverty. Also, the Wangs conceded that we tell you that when you force countries in long-term underdevelopment, you cannot focus on things like social spending, and it doesn't reach the people properly allocated to the people that need it the most, like the people in slums. Because if their argument was true, we would say that slums on net would be getting better and decreasing if there was more public investment. But empirically, that's not true. So the weighing's done. They don't really have any weighing on their case either. You don't know what this decrease in income inequality actually does in the round, but you do know we impact the most amount of people, and our link is conceded. But on their case, two really big issues, and they really haven't been responded to. First of all, their own bird evidence, we've said it like 5 times in this round, concludes that all of their benefits go away after a short time, and the benefits on economic growth from the IMF are muted. Their evidence is really, really bad. Pull the trigger for the neg.
Thank you. Good round, everyone. Thank you so much for judging.
Yeah, good round. Thanks for judging.
Good round. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Congratulations on making it to the runoffs. This was a pretty good debate. The decision is a 3-0 for the con. So I can go first. I voted con. I think that this debate just generally was kind of messy. Like, there was very little explanation of the internal link level of arguments in the final rebuttals. Also, there's just like a lack of external impacts, which makes weighing hard. Like, about just like growth in the interim, or like generally is good. Both teams are throwing out words like econ, growth, spending, austerity, etc., without more contextualization, which makes giving a decision hard. Also, this could just be a me thing, but like I don't think that growth just like growth in general as an impact is an impact. Like, I have no idea why econ growth in the interim or just abstractly is good. This could just be because I go for growth bad a lot, but I just don't know why it's an impact. So the affirmative response, the reason I voted was on the slums argument. The affirmative response to slums does very little to mitigate the impact for me. One was there was a story extended about slums for me in every speech, and a lack of answers means I grant at least some contextualization in the later speeches. I think that there's a clear story extended throughout the debate. So this thing that was like, there's not a story, doesn't really work for me. Two, the argument about liberalization and being poor before intervention doesn't respond well to slums, because the neg has read decent ev that the IMF restricted social spending on housing in these countries and restructured their economies. So there is a solid link for me that even if growth was low before the IMF still restricted spending on housing. This could be convincing, but I don't have it applied specifically to the slums in the final focus, and there's just not enough time on it for it to be a major portion of my decision. So three, I don't know why an increased allocation of resources or social spending would solve the slums impact, because the neg ev again about why the IMF stopped the social spending is better than yours, and that it increases poverty traps that people cannot get out of. So I have no idea why just broadly resource spending good would solve the slums impact. Four, I have no idea why food would be a prerequisite to housing. It might be a prerequisite to econ growth, but that's not, but there's no correlation of economic growth solving housing, especially when they've read specific evidence that says that housing in general creates poverty traps for people. So at the end, I'm left with a pretty large slum impact that creates poverty within countries, which is bad. I know that for sure, but there will be an increase. So I look to the AF scenarios now, and I'm given very little offensive reason why the IMF is good besides one, resource allocation, but I don't know why this is good as an abstract principle. And slums actually seems to turn it by creating cycles of poverty that I don't have an answer to, that like this is a prerequisite. It creates cycles of poverty. The spending cannot reach them, and it creates poverty. I don't have a great answer to that throughout the debate, and it seems like a prerequisite that just wasn't answered for me. It could be pretty new, but it seems to be just like contextually there throughout the entire speeches, even if it's like not like just stated this is a prerequisite. Throughout the entire speeches, it seems to be just like this is a prerequisite to growth. And then two was this like food security growth thing. Again, growth seems nebulous to me, absent an impact. And all I have is that domestic markets get better for the like food thing. But again, like slums seems like a prerequisite. I don't know how like food gets to them. So in reality, it's just like big slums impact seems like a prerequisite to your impact. Don't have an answer. Vote neg.
Okay, sweet. So I looked at the round pretty similarly. I'll be quick. Starting on the neg case, this whole like debate that comes before the next contentions, I don't evaluate. I consider it a wash. I'm given two different stories by either side, but not told which one to prefer. Specifically on the neg case, I give them their argument on slums, on the housing argument. I think the responses made by the AF aren't enough. Their evidence is like pretty clear to support the argument that they're making, at which point I can pull the trigger there because the weighing is conceded and the prereq made on it. I think this like turn that's extended on like this nutritional gap is one, very blippy throughout the round and not very developed, but also two, not properly terminalized until like very late in final focus. And it's not enough for me to pull that trigger for the AF on this like small turn over their huge slums impact. And then also like this is kind of like on the AF case as well, which is that like essentially this warranting by the neg that's never responded to about long-term underdevelopment, meaning that they can't focus on social spending, is never responded to, at which point like I can't vote on the AF's contention that they go for. The other thing is this bird indite that's extended in every speech by the neg is also not addressed, at which point I can't really buy the like the impacts the AF is giving me, because if I'm told that in the long term they're all gone, then like I can't vote for that. So yeah, that's why I vote neg.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Good round.
Good luck, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.